Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a world where the word China doesn't exist yet. Not as a country, not as an idea, not even as a shared identity. You're standing on damp earth near a wide, restless river, the ground soft under your feet, the air carrying the smell of wet soil, smoke and plant ash. Somewhere close, someone coughs from the fire, and further away you hear the steady splash of water against the banks. This place feels alive, but not in a friendly way. It feels watchful, and just so we're clear from the start, you probably won't survive this. Most people don't. Survival here is not heroic, it's conditional. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what the local time is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not in a nation, you're not even in a kingdom. You're in a cluster of river communities that share habits, fears and weather, but not loyalty. People identify by family, by settlement, by the stretch of land they can walk across in a morning. Beyond that, the world dissolves into uncertainty. The Yellow River dominates everything here. It doesn't flow politely. It shifts, splits, floods and retreats without asking permission, dumping fertile soil one year and destroying entire settlements the next. One mainstream historical fact is clear and uncontested. Early civilization in this region forms because of rivers like this, and despite them not because they're gentle, but because they're powerful enough to reward those who survive them. Daily life is narrow and demanding. You wake with the light because there's no reason to stay awake after dark, unless you enjoy tripping over things or inviting trouble. Homes are built from packed earth and wood, repaired constantly because rain, insects and time never stop working against you. Food is simple, millet porridge, roots, whatever small animals can be caught. Meat is rare enough that when it appears, everyone notices. Hunger isn't a crisis, it's the background condition. There is leadership here, but it's fragile. A leader is someone who organizes labor, remembers old solutions, and convinces people to listen. Authority doesn't come from law or divine right yet. It comes from competence and trust. If a leader fails to coordinate flood defenses or mishandles food storage, people leave. If enough leave, the leader stops being a leader. Power is personal and temporary. Here's a detail that matters more than it sounds. Nothing is written down. Knowledge lives in people. If someone who knows how to reinforce a riverbank dies unexpectedly, that knowledge can vanish with them. Historians still argue whether early social hierarchies existed in any stable form at this stage, or whether status constantly shifted based on age, skill, and circumstance. Living inside it, hierarchy feels fluid. Respect is earned, lost, and renegotiated all the time. The river isn't just water, it's explanation. When it floods, people don't say nature happened. They say someone failed. A ritual wasn't done properly. A warning was ignored. This habit of linking human behavior to natural disaster forms early, long before anyone formalizes it. It makes sense here. If everything depends on coordination, then failure must have a cause, and causes must be moral. Rituals grow out of this need. Offerings of food, animals, and drink are made before planting, before travel, before major decisions. These aren't elaborate ceremonies yet. They're practical acts meant to stabilize an unstable world. A quirky but important tidbit: animal bones from these offerings aren't discarded. They're reused as tools, decorations, and sometimes for early forms of divination, heated, cracked, and read for meaning. Even waste has value here. Violence exists, but it's intimate. Disputes over land, water access, or marriage can escalate quickly because there's no higher authority to appeal to. There are no courts, no written rules, just mediation by elders and leaders whose authority depends on keeping the group intact. Punishments are social before they're physical. Exile, shame, forced labor. Being cast out isn't symbolic, it's usually fatal. Despite the hardship, there's no sense that life is abnormal. This is just how the world works. People don't compare their suffering to a better past or imagine a dramatically improved future. They measure success by continuity. Did the children survive? Did the fields produce? Did the river stay where it was supposed to? Stories circulate at night, told quietly near fires. They speak of culture heroes, figures who taught people how to farm, fish, build, and live together. These stories are repeated carefully because remembering feels protective. Historians still argue whether these figures represent real leaders, collective memory, or moral teaching tools invented later. For you, their function is simple. They explain why order exists at all. What you're living inside is not the beginning of a nation, but the beginning of a pattern. Communities learning that coordination beats isolation, that memory beats improvisation, that someone who can organize labor around a river holds power greater than anyone with a weapon alone. As you settle into the rhythm of this place, the mud, the smoke, the constant attention to weather, you can't yet see dynasties forming, but you can feel the pressure that will create them. The river doesn't care who you are, but the people who learn to manage it will soon matter more than anyone else. The river doesn't just shape the land, it reshapes memory. Every flood erases something and leaves something else behind, and over time people start to notice that survival depends less on strength and more on coordination. This is where the idea of rule begins to harden into something recognizable, even if no one would call it a dynasty yet. You're now living in a world that later generations will name the Shah, though no one around you uses that word with any confidence. Flood control becomes the center of everything. When the river swells, you don't react individually anymore, you gather. Channels are dug, banks reinforced, overflow paths planned. Someone has to decide where labor goes first, whose fields are protected, whose will be sacrificed to save others. One mainstream historical fact sits beneath the legend here. Large-scale flood management along the Yellow River required organized labor far beyond a single village, implying early regional authority. This is where you, the Great, enters collective memory. Not as a distant god, but as a figure tied to work. Stories say he traveled constantly, passing his own home without entering it for years, focusing only on directing water rather than blocking it. Historians still argue whether Yu was a single historical leader or a symbolic name attached to generations of flood engineers. From inside the story, the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is that leadership is now associated with problem-solving, not ancestry alone. The shift is subtle but profound. Earlier leaders persuaded, now they coordinate. Labor becomes expected rather than negotiated. You're told when to dig, where to pile earth, how long to work. Refusing isn't framed as rebellion, it's framed as endangering everyone. Authority gains a moral edge. Settlements grow around these projects. Temporary camps become permanent villages. Storage pits multiply. Grain is redistributed more deliberately, not equally, but strategically. People who manage food and labor gain influence even when they don't look powerful. Power starts to detach from physical strength. Here's a detail that quietly changes everything. Leadership begins to pass from parent to child. Tradition says, Yu Sun Chi inherited authority rather than earning it. Whether this happened exactly as later texts describe is debated, but the idea itself is critical. Hereditary rule introduces continuity and resentment. Elders remember when leaders were chosen. Younger people grow up assuming leadership is inherited. Daily life remains brutal. Flood work destroys bodies slowly. You spend weeks in cold water, lifting baskets of soil until your hands crack and bleed. There's no concept of off-duty. When the river rises, everything else pauses. Failure isn't abstract. A poorly placed channel can drown an entire settlement. Ritual adapts to authority. Offerings are now organized centrally. Decisions about when and how to appease unseen forces are no longer communal debates. Someone decides, others follow. This concentrates not just power, but explanation. When floods subside, credit flows upward. When they don't, blame does too. Archaeological sites like Erlitou, though you don't know the name, show evidence of palatial structures, specialized workshops, and social stratification during this period. Historians still argue whether Erlitou represents the Shire capital or an unrelated culture later absorbed into the story. Living here, what you experience is hierarchy becoming physical. Some houses are larger, some people eat better, some commands carry farther. Violence remains local, but consequences widen. A dispute between villages can now draw in regional authority. Punishments scale up. Exile becomes relocation. Resistance becomes dangerous. Stories grow more confident. The Shire is spoken of as inevitable, as chosen, as the natural outcome of order. Memory is being shaped even as events unfold. People repeat the same names, the same lessons, because repetition stabilizes meaning. As seasons turn, the river behaves for now. Fields produce, people breathe. The idea settles in quietly. Whoever controls the water controls life. And control, once normalized, rarely returns to those who never held it. The Shire aren't an empire, they're a precedent. And precedents have a way of outlasting the people who create them. Once authority settles around water and labor, it needs somewhere to sit. Not symbolically, physically. You begin to notice certain places pulling attention toward them, drawing people, resources, and decisions inward. Paths converge, storage pits deepen, workshops appear where before there were only homes. You're moving now through what later scholars will point to as early elite centers, places like Erletu, though no one living here thinks of them as capitals in the way later cities will be understood. What makes these places different isn't size alone, it's coordination. You see areas set aside for specialized work, pottery shaped in consistent styles, tools produced in batches, ritual objects crafted with care rather than improvisation. One mainstream historical fact anchors this shift clearly. Archaeological sites associated with early Shem period cultures show evidence of planned layouts, elite residences, and centralized production, suggesting organized governance rather than loose tribal leadership. You feel the hierarchy before anyone explains it. Some people don't dig or farm anymore. They supervise, they store, they decide. Their homes sit slightly higher, closer to communal spaces, less vulnerable to flooding. This isn't luxury yet, it's insulation. Power here means distance from disaster. Daily life for most people doesn't improve. If anything, it becomes more predictable and more demanding. Labor is scheduled. Contributions are tracked mentally, if not formally. Grain flows inward before it flows back out. When shortages hit, redistribution happens, but selectively. Families connected to leadership survive lean years more easily. Everyone notices. No one says it out loud. Here's a detail that matters more than it seems. Craft specialists begin to exist as a class. Potters, tool makers, ritual artisans, their skills take time to learn, which means they rely on others for food. This dependency binds them to the center. Specialization deepens inequality, but it also deepens interdependence. Ritual spaces become more formal. Instead of offerings made anywhere, certain locations are preferred. Fire pits are maintained. Objects used in ceremonies are kept rather than discarded. Repetition gives rituals weight. Authority leans into this. When leaders preside over ceremonies tied to successful flood seasons, memory links them to stability. Historians still argue whether social stratification during this period was rigid or situational. Living inside it, the lines feel real but permeable. A family can rise through service or fall through misfortune. Nothing is guaranteed yet. Trade increases. Stone, jade, shells, and pottery move between regions. You don't think of this as commerce. It's exchange tied to obligation and alliance. Exotic materials signal reach. A jade ornament isn't just decoration. It's proof someone has connections beyond the river bend. Conflict grows more complex. Disputes are no longer just between neighbors. Competing centers claim overlapping territories. Authority is tested not only by nature, but by rivals offering alternative leadership. Violence remains limited, but its potential expands. Writing still doesn't exist, but symbols do. Marks scratched into pottery, repeated patterns, consistent shapes. Memory is being externalized slowly, imperfectly. This matters because once memory leaves the body, it becomes harder to challenge. One quiet but unsettling change. Leadership begins to feel permanent. Children grow up assuming certain families will always decide things. Elders who remember earlier fluidity become rarer. Precedent hardens into expectation. Archaeology later uncovers roads, palatial foundations, and ritual vessels from this era and argues over labels. Was this truly Shah? Was it something else later absorbed into the story? Historians still argue because material evidence doesn't come with names attached. What you experience isn't a label, it's concentration of power. You walk through these early centers, aware that decisions made here ripple outward. Flood channels are planned here. Labor demands originate here. Ritual calendars are set here. Even if authority remains fragile, its center of gravity has shifted. The river still dominates everything, but now it's mediated. Between water and village stands an emerging system. Unfinished, uneven, but undeniably present. You're no longer living in scattered survival. You're living inside a structure that remembers itself. And once a system starts remembering itself, forgetting becomes dangerous. The center you've been moving through doesn't just organize labor anymore. It begins to demand materials that change how power feels in your hands. Stone tools still exist, but something heavier, rarer, and far more deliberate starts to circulate. You first notice it in objects that aren't meant for work at all. Thick vessels with sharp edges, smooth surfaces, and designs pressed into them so deeply they catch the light. This is bronze, and once it appears, authority stops being merely practical and starts becoming visible. Bronze doesn't come from one place. It demands copper from one region, tin from another, charcoal from forests that must be managed, and skilled workers who understand heat, timing, and molds. One mainstream historical fact matters here more than any myth. Bronze production in early China required coordinated supply networks and specialized labor, meaning whoever controlled bronze controlled far more than tools. They controlled organization itself. You don't see bronze everywhere, that's the point. Farmers still use stone and wood. Bronze is reserved. Weapons, ritual vessels, symbols of command. When someone carries a bronze axe, it isn't because they're chopping wood, it's because they're someone you're expected to obey. The material itself creates hierarchy. You can't improvise bronze, you can't stumble into it. You either belong to the system that produces it, or you don't. Workshops appear near elite compounds. You smell them before you see them: burning charcoal, hot metal, damp clay molds. The casting process is slow and controlled. Molds are made in pieces, fitted together carefully, then broken apart after casting. This means each object is planned, not poured. Here's a crucial detail people often miss. Piece mold casting allows for repetition of design. Symbols of authority can be standardized. Power starts to look the same everywhere it goes. Daily life tightens around this new center. Labor is demanded not only for flood control but for mining, transport, and fuel production. Forests are cut back aggressively. Charcoal becomes as important as grain. You begin to see hills stripped bare, their soil exposed and fragile. The environment absorbs the cost of metallurgy long before anyone thinks to question it. Ritual transforms alongside technology. Bronze vessels become central to ceremonies. They hold food, drink, offerings. They are heavy, durable, and meant to last, unlike wooden bowls or woven baskets. When leaders use bronze in ritual, they anchor memory. These objects will outlive the people who use them, carrying inscriptions or designs that quietly say we were here and we mattered. Historians still argue whether bronze emerged primarily as a practical military technology or as a ritual prestige material that later became weaponized. Living inside the shift, the distinction feels artificial. Ritual and violence aren't separate worlds. They reinforce each other. A leader who controls rituals controls morale. A leader who controls weapons controls outcomes. Bronze ties both together. Conflict becomes sharper. Bronze weapons cut more effectively, break less often, and intimidate. Villages without access to bronze find themselves at a disadvantage even before fighting begins. Negotiations change tone. Threats carry weight because everyone knows what bronze can do, but there's a cost. Bronze is expensive in labor and resources. Elites extract more from the land and the people to sustain production. Taxes aren't just higher, they're more targeted. Grain feeds workers, labor feeds furnaces. The margin between survival and collapse narrows further for ordinary families. Social roles harden. Craft specialists become permanent dependents of elite households. They are valued, protected, and controlled. Their knowledge is power, and power is not allowed to wander. Training becomes restricted. Techniques are guarded. Innovation slows because stability matters more than experimentation. One subtle change reshapes everything. Authority begins to feel permanent. Bronze objects don't decay like wood or fiber. They endure. When leaders display them, they project continuity, past, present, and future bound together in metal. Memory is no longer just spoken, it's cast. Archaeology later finds caches of these vessels, buried carefully, sometimes deliberately broken, sometimes preserved intact. Scholars argue about their function, their symbolism, their owners, but standing here you understand their purpose instinctively. They make power heavy, they make it hard to ignore. As bronze spreads through elite networks, the earlier flood-based leadership of the Shah world begins to look insufficient. Control of water is still vital, but control of material, labor, and memory now matters more. The balance shifts quietly. Whoever masters bronze masters the story people will tell about who deserves to rule. And once authority is forged into objects that survive generations, it becomes much harder to dismantle, because even when rulers fall, their metal remains waiting to be claimed by whoever comes next. Once bronze enters ritual, questions stop being asked casually. They become formal, prepared, preserved. You're drawn toward a space set slightly apart from ordinary life, quieter, cleaner, watched more carefully. Fires burn here, even when no one needs warmth. This is where uncertainty is managed, not by debate but by procedure. Bones lie stacked nearby, mostly cattle shoulder blades, sometimes the flat underside of turtle shells. They're cleaned meticulously, scraped smooth, drilled with shallow hollows on one side. One mainstream historical fact grounds this moment firmly. These are oracle bones, and they carry the earliest confirmed Chinese writing we know of. Writing doesn't begin with poetry or law, it begins with anxiety. A question is chosen carefully. Not everyone gets to ask. The wording matters because the answer will be remembered. A diviner carves the question into the bone. Will the harvest be good? Should we attack this neighbor? Has an ancestor caused the sickness? The bone is heated until it cracks. The crack is red. The interpretation is spoken aloud. Then, and this part matters, the result is recorded. This changes time itself. Before, memory faded with people. Now memory is fixed. The question, the answer, and sometimes the outcome are all marked. Authority no longer relies only on reputation. It relies on record. If a divination worked once, it can be cited again. If it failed, the failure can be explained, reinterpreted, or blamed on improper ritual. The system protects itself. Here's a detail that often surprises people. Many oracle bones include notes added later saying whether the prediction proved correct. This isn't blind faith, it's feedback. Divination becomes a self-validating archive. Religion and governance fuse completely. Ancestors aren't distant figures. They're active participants in decision-making. They approve wars, warn of floods, comment on childbirth, illness, and sacrifice. The ruler's authority rests on exclusive access to these conversations. If you control the questions, you shape reality. Historians still argue whether Shang rulers truly believed the answers they received, or whether divination functioned as political theatre. Living here, the distinction feels irrelevant. Belief and power reinforce each other. When an army wins after a favorable reading, faith deepens. When it loses, the explanation shifts without breaking the framework. Daily life bends around these rituals. Certain days are declared unsuitable for travel or work. Offerings are prepared according to strict guidelines. Animals are raised specifically for sacrifice. Nothing about this feels optional. To ignore ritual is to invite disaster, not just personally but collectively. The cost is high. Animals that could feed families are given to ancestors instead. Labor is diverted toward ritual preparation, but these costs are framed as protection. A failed harvest after insufficient ritual feels worse than hunger caused by sacrifice. At least sacrifice suggests effort. Human sacrifice enters the picture here, though not constantly or casually. Prisoners of war, criminals, and servants may be offered during major rituals or royal burials. The scale and frequency are debated. Historians still argue whether human sacrifice was central to Shang religion or exaggerated by later accounts. What you experience is selective horror, rare enough to shock, common enough to intimidate. The written marks on bones begin to standardize language. Symbols repeat, meanings stabilize. This is how writing escapes ritual and starts creeping toward administration. Lists of offerings, counts of captives, names of places. Writing doesn't replace speech, but it outranks it. Social distance widens. Ordinary people hear about divinations after the fact, filtered through authority. You're told the ancestors approve, or they don't. The reasoning is never fully shared. Mystery becomes a tool. When answers come from cracks in heated bone, arguing feels foolish. Memory now belongs to the center. What's written is remembered. What isn't fades. This is how history starts to narrow. Not by lies, but by selection. Events tied to ritual are preserved. Everyday suffering disappears from record. You leave the ritual space aware that something irreversible has happened. Power no longer rests only in strength or coordination. It rests in interpretation, in access to unseen approval, and in marks that outlast living voices. From here on, authority will not just act, it will justify itself. Carefully, repeatedly, and in writing. Once questions can be preserved, power starts to accumulate weight. Not metaphorical weight, actual mass. You feel it in the walls that rise around Shang centers, thick layers of rammed earth compacted by thousands of feet and tools striking in rhythm. These walls don't just keep enemies out, they keep people in, separating those who decide from those who obey. You're living now inside a Shang city at its height, where organization itself feels imposing. One mainstream historical fact anchors this phase clearly. Shang urban centers show evidence of planned layouts with palatial compounds, workshops, storage areas, and defensive walls, indicating a highly stratified society. You don't need a map to see it. Space tells you who matters. The closer you are to the center, the fewer risks you carry. Floods reach you last. Grain shortages reach you last. Violence is managed before it reaches you. Clan structure tightens. Identity is no longer just village-based. You belong to a lineage, and that lineage determines your access to protection, ritual participation, and food during shortages. The ruling clan claims descent from powerful ancestors, whose names are repeated endlessly in divination records. This repetition matters. It turns ancestry into proof. Daily life for most people grows heavier rather than richer. Fields still need tending, but more grain is pulled inward to support soldiers, craftsmen, and ritual specialists. Tribute becomes regularized. It's no longer help when needed, but expectation. Failure to deliver isn't explained as misfortune. It's framed as disobedience. Here's a detail that often goes unnoticed. Shang armies are not permanent standing forces in the modern sense, but they are increasingly organized. Warriors train together. Equipment is standardized. Command structures exist. Warfare stops being a seasonal feud and becomes an extension of state planning. Bronze weapons play a central role here, but they're not handed out freely. Most soldiers carry simpler arms, wooden shafts, stone points, while elites wield bronze. This creates layered violence. Orders come from those best protected, while risk falls downward. Authority becomes safer than obedience. War itself takes on ritual form. Campaigns are planned through divination. Victories are celebrated with offerings. Defeats require explanation. Prisoners are counted carefully because they are resources, labor, leverage, or offerings. Nothing is wasted, not even enemies. Historians still argue whether Shang warfare was primarily expansionist or defensive, aimed at controlling resources and rivals rather than building a unified state. From inside the system, the motive feels simpler. Security through dominance. Threats are easier to manage when they're broken before they grow. Religion saturates this violence. Ancestors are consulted before battle. Their approval transforms killing into duty. Without that approval, action feels dangerous. This belief protects rulers from blame. If ancestors endorse the campaign, outcomes must be accepted, even when they're catastrophic. Social roles harden further. Craftsmen tied to bronze production are closely monitored. Their skills are too valuable to drift. Movement is restricted. Knowledge is guarded. Innovation slows because consistency is safer than experimentation. The system doesn't want surprises. You notice how fear changes tone. It's no longer sudden or chaotic. It's structured. People know what happens when rules are broken. Punishments are public enough to be remembered, but not constant enough to disrupt productivity. Control becomes routine. The written record expands, but selectively. Rituals, victories, offerings, lineages, these are preserved. Crop failures, exhaustion, and quiet resentment are not. Historians still argue whether this imbalance distorts our understanding of Shang society. Living it, you feel the distortion forming in real time. What matters to power is what survives in record. As you move through the city, past workshops ringing with metal, past walls that block wind and view alike, you sense the system's confidence. It has ancestors, weapons, records, and walls. It believes itself durable, but durability has a cost. The system consumes more each year. More labor, more grain, more obedience. And systems that consume without pause eventually test the patience of everyone beneath them. The Shang world feels strong now. Dense, heavy, but it's also brittle in ways no oracle bone can predict. Pressure doesn't announce itself as weakness. It shows up as repetition. The same campaigns fought again, the same rituals repeated more urgently, the same demands issued with slightly sharper edges. From inside the Shang world, nothing feels like collapse yet. It feels like effort, constant effort to keep everything from slipping. The Shang king still stands at the center, still consults ancestors, still commands armies. But you hear more about the western frontier now. A people called the Zhou appear increasingly in reports, not as barbarians, but as organized allies who fight well, manage land effectively, and most concerning of all, seem loyal to each other rather than dependent on Shang authority. One mainstream historical fact frames this turning point. The Zhou began as a frontier state under Shang influence, before gradually consolidating power and challenging Shang dominance. This matters because it means the Shang aren't facing an unknown enemy, they're facing a system that learned by watching them. The Zhou govern differently. Their leaders still honor ancestors, but they speak more often about conduct, about restraint, fairness, protection of the people. At first, Shang elites dismiss this as rhetoric, but rhetoric spreads. Zhou leaders reward loyalty, distribute land carefully, and build coalitions rather than relying purely on intimidation. Here's a detail that later historians paid close attention to. Zhou leaders adopt Shang ritual forms while subtly changing their meaning. They perform sacrifices, use bronze vessels, and consult spirits, but they frame success as moral approval rather than ancestral favor alone. It's a shift in explanation, and explanation shapes obedience. Military pressure builds slowly. Shang campaigns against the Zhou don't end decisively. Supply lines stretch. Victories feel temporary. Losses linger longer. Divination answers become less comforting. When ancestors approve a campaign that fails, interpretation grows strained. Historians still argue whether Shang decline was driven more by internal exhaustion or external challenge. Living here, the two are inseparable. Heavy extraction weakens loyalty. Weakened loyalty makes resistance harder. Resistance demands more extraction. The cycle tightens. Inside the capital, you notice tension among elites. Clans compete for influence. Ritual precedence becomes political leverage. Who pours wine first at ceremonies matters more than it used to. These aren't trivial details. They're signs of a system struggling to distribute honor without fracturing. For ordinary people, the change is subtle but real. Labor demands increase. Campaigns run longer. Absences stretch from weeks to seasons. Fields suffer. Grain reserves thin. The system still functions, but it feels brittle, like a wall reinforced again and again in the same place. The Zhou are talked about with a mix of irritation and unease. They aren't accused of impiety. That accusation would be comforting. Instead, they're described as disciplined, orderly, calm. Those are dangerous qualities in a rival. When the decisive conflict finally comes, it isn't experienced as a single dramatic clash. It's confusion. Units hesitate. Allies fail to arrive. Orders conflict. When news spreads that the Shang king has fallen, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like the ground shifting under words everyone thought were permanent. Historians still argue whether the Zhou victory was seen at the time as inevitable or shocking. From where you stand, it's both. The pressure was there. The break still feels unreal. Afterward, destruction is restrained. Shang rituals continue. Bronze vessels are reused. Shang elites are absorbed, relocated, or marginalized rather than erased. This isn't mercy, it's strategy. The Zhou don't want chaos, they want legitimacy, and legitimacy requires explanation. So a new story spreads. The Shang did not fall because they were weak, but because they failed morally. Heaven withdrew support. The world didn't collapse, it corrected itself. That explanation matters more than the battle, because once people accept that power can be lost through failure of conduct, obedience becomes conditional. And conditional obedience is far more dangerous to rulers than rebellion. You don't hear the term yet, but you're standing at the birth of an idea that will outlast armies. The belief that rulers answer to something higher than themselves, and that this higher force can change its mind. The Shang world doesn't end in fire. It ends in reasoning. The new explanation spreads faster than any army ever could. You hear it repeated in markets, at ritual gatherings, in the careful language officials use when issuing orders. Heaven has standards now. Heaven observes conduct. Heaven rewards restraint and withdraws support from excess. This idea settles into the world so smoothly that it feels like it was always waiting to be named. The Zhou don't present themselves as conquerors. They present themselves as caretakers, who arrived late to a task the Shang mishandled. One mainstream historical fact underpins everything that follows. The Zhou articulate what later generations will call the mandate of heaven, the belief that political authority is conditional on moral behavior and can be revoked. This is not just a religious claim, it's a political operating system. What makes it effective is its flexibility. Victory proves heaven's favor, defeat proves heaven's displeasure. Floods, droughts, and famine become evidence rather than accidents. Nothing happens without meaning anymore. The world becomes readable, at least to those in power. You notice the shift in tone immediately. Orders are issued with justification now. Tax demands are framed as necessary for harmony. Punishments are explained as corrective rather than cruel. Even restraint becomes a performance. Zhou leaders emphasize moderation in ritual, simplicity in personal display, and humility in speech. Whether they always practice these virtues matters less than the fact that they claim to. Here's a detail that often goes unnoticed. Early Zhou texts rarely describe heaven in personal terms. It isn't a god with moods or a voice. It's distant, abstract, and silent. This matters because silence can't be contradicted. Interpretation belongs entirely to those who claim to understand it. Ritual changes accordingly. Ancestors remain important, but they no longer monopolize legitimacy. Heaven sits above them, watching both rulers and spirits. Sacrifices become more measured. Excessive displays start to look suspicious rather than impressive. The Zhou don't abolish Shang customs, they reframe them. Historians still argue whether the mandate genuinely constrained rulers or merely provided moral language to justify power shifts after the fact. Living under it, you feel both sides at once. On one hand, rulers speak more carefully. On the other, nothing stops them from interpreting heaven conveniently. For ordinary people, the idea introduces a strange form of hope. If suffering signals moral failure at the top, then suffering is no longer meaningless. At the same time, it introduces danger. If disaster proves moral decay, someone must be blamed. That blame doesn't always stay with kings. Education begins to matter more. Sons of elites are taught histories that emphasize moral rise and fall. Past dynasties are recast as lessons rather than ancestors. The Shai and Shang are no longer just predecessors. They are warnings. Memory is reorganized into a sequence of moral experiments. Administration expands quietly. Record-keeping increases. Decrees reference precedent. Rulers cite past failures to justify present policies. History becomes a tool, not just a story. What's remembered is what supports the mandate. What doesn't fades. One consequence becomes clear quickly. Rebellion is no longer treason by definition. It is framed as correction, if successful. This doesn't encourage constant revolt, but it permanently destabilizes absolute authority. Power must now perform competence continuously. The Zhou king presents himself as the son of heaven, not as heaven itself. This distinction matters. It creates distance. The king serves a principle larger than his lineage. At least that's the claim. It allows loyalty to shift without the world ending. As this idea takes root, the land grows quieter. Not because conflict ends, but because explanation smooths over violence. Wars are justified as restoration. Punishments are framed as necessity. Everyone learns to speak the same moral language, even when they mean different things by it. You live inside this new logic without ceremony. No one asks whether you believe it. Belief is assumed. Heaven has become the backdrop of politics, like the sky above the fields, always present, never questioned, endlessly interpreted. And once power claims the sky itself as its witness, it no longer needs to shout. It only needs to explain. Once heaven is placed above everyone, power learns to relax. Not because it has become kind, but because it no longer needs to prove itself every day. This is the world of the early Western Zhou, when the system feels balanced, when explanation, ritual, and authority line up cleanly enough that most people stop questioning them. You live inside a rhythm that feels settled, almost calm, especially compared to the strain and uncertainty of the Shang collapse. Land is redistributed deliberately. Zhou kings grant territory to relatives, trusted allies, and loyal commanders, binding them into a network of obligation that stretches across valleys and plains. One mainstream historical fact defines this structure. The Western Zhou ruled through a feudal-style system in which land grants came with duties, military service, tribute, and ritual loyalty to the Zhou king. Authority radiates outward rather than pressing down from a single center. You live on land claimed by one of these lords. You will never meet the king, but his presence is felt through calendars, rituals, and expectations that arrive indirectly. Your lord holds feasts at set times of year, hosting neighboring elites to reaffirm bonds. These gatherings matter more than they appear to. Seating order, speaking order, and who pours wine for whom are all carefully watched. Honor is distributed publicly. Here's a detail that often escapes attention. These feasts function as audits. A lord who fails to host properly signals weakness. One who overspends signals instability. Balance is everything. Excess draws suspicion now, not admiration. Ritual life settles into regular cycles. Ancestors are honored on fixed dates. Heaven is invoked in broader ceremonies led by the king or his representatives. The tone is restrained. Loud displays of power feel outdated. The Zhou style values moderation, at least outwardly. This restraint becomes part of legitimacy itself. Daily life for ordinary people remains demanding, but it feels less chaotic. Taxes are predictable. Labor obligations are scheduled rather than sudden. Flood control projects continue, but coordination is smoother. You still work hard, but you can plan. Planning itself feels like progress. Writing spreads slowly, still restricted to elites, but its purpose shifts. Inscriptions on bronze vessels commemorate land grants, military service, and ritual participation. These records matter because they formalize relationships. If something is cast into bronze, it's harder to dispute later. Memory becomes durable. Historians still argue whether this early Zhou stability was genuinely peaceful, or simply appears so because the records focus on elite ritual rather than everyday suffering. Living it, You sense both. Violence exists, but it's contained. Fear hasn't vanished, but it's quieter. One consequence of this system is distance. Lords far from the Zhou heartland gain autonomy simply because messages travel slowly. Over time, they rely less on royal approval and more on local strength. This isn't rebellion yet. It's convenience becoming habit. Children of elite families are trained carefully. They learn ritual conduct, lineage histories, and the moral lessons of past dynasties. Education isn't about curiosity, it's about continuity. The past is taught as a series of warnings and confirmations, not open questions. As years pass, the Zhou king's role becomes more symbolic. He leads the most important ceremonies, he embodies heaven's order, but enforcement increasingly depends on cooperation rather than command. The system works because most people still believe it does. You feel the calm most strongly at night. Fewer alarms, fewer sudden demands. The world feels ordered enough that exhaustion gives way to routine rather than anxiety. This is the Zhou at their most convincing. The moment later generations will look back on as a golden age, but calm built on distance is fragile. As obligations loosen and local power thickens, the balance that keeps everything aligned begins to tilt. Nothing breaks yet, the system still functions, but beneath the ritual and restraint, the conditions that once held the Shang together and then tore them apart are quietly reforming. The Zhou order doesn't collapse suddenly. It stretches, and stretched systems, no matter how elegant, eventually discover where they are weakest. The shift begins so gently that most people don't notice it happening. There is no announcement, no rebellion, no dramatic refusal to obey the Zhou king. Instead, authority thins as it travels. Orders arrive late, tribute is adjusted slightly. Ritual obligations are observed but without urgency. Distance turns reverence into habit, and habit into formality. You feel it first in communication. Messengers take longer. Roads aren't repaired as quickly outside core regions. A lord who once waited for royal approval now acts first and informs later. One mainstream historical fact sits beneath this slow drift. As the Zhou realm expanded, kings struggled to maintain direct control over distant territories, allowing regional lords to accumulate independent power. Local rulers begin to behave like permanent authorities rather than temporary stewards. Their armies answer to them directly. Their rituals prioritize local ancestors over the Zhou king's lineage. When disputes arise between neighboring lords, appeals to the royal court feel symbolic rather than decisive. The king still exists, but increasingly as a reference point, not an enforcer. Here's a subtle but important detail. Bronze inscriptions from this later period focus more on local family achievements and less on royal grants. Memory shifts location. What's recorded reflects what's valued, and what's valued is no longer centered exclusively on the king. Daily life absorbs this change quietly. Taxes don't necessarily rise yet, but they fragment. Different lords demand different things. Ritual calendars drift. What counts as proper behavior in one region draws criticism in another. Cultural unity loosens, not through conflict, but through variation. Historians still argue whether the Zhou kings could have reversed this process with stronger leadership, or whether fragmentation was inevitable given the scale of the territory. Living inside it, the decline feels administrative rather than dramatic. No one wakes up thinking the Zhou have failed. They wake up thinking local decisions matter more. Feasts become more competitive. Lords display wealth more openly, using ritual to signal independence without openly challenging royal authority. A successful harvest funds larger ceremonies. A strong military presence subtly reinforces claims. Everything is still framed within Zhou legitimacy, but stretched to its limit. Education adapts too. Noble children are taught loyalty to the Zhou king, but they are also taught to prioritize their own state's interests. Moral language remains, but its application narrows. Heaven still watches, but perhaps it watches regions now, not a single ruler. You notice increased tension at borders. Patrols appear where none existed before. Small skirmishes break out, then are smoothed over diplomatically. These aren't wars yet, they're tests, measuring response, strength, patience. One change feels especially significant. Punishment becomes inconsistent. A crime punished harshly in one state is ignored in another. Justice loses uniformity. That inconsistency erodes the moral clarity the mandate once provided. If heaven's standards produce different outcomes everywhere, interpretation starts to feel optional. Ordinary people adapt by lowering expectations. Loyalty becomes local. Survival depends on knowing which lord is rising and which is weakening. Quiet migration increases. Families relocate toward regions that feel safer or better governed. This movement itself accelerates fragmentation. Ritual remains central, but its meaning shifts. Ceremonies honor the Zhao king, but more as tradition than obligation. People perform them because they've always been performed, not because they expect enforcement to follow. The Zhou system still stands. No one has overthrown it. But it now relies on memory rather than power, and memory fades unevenly. The king's authority is still spoken aloud, still respected in theory, but in practice, the world has begun to organize itself without waiting. This is how long orders end. Not with collapse, but with quiet substitution. By the time people realize something has changed, they've already adapted to the new reality. And adaptation, once complete, is far harder to undo than rebellion ever was. When the first open fighting breaks out, people insist it's temporary. A dispute between neighbors, a misunderstanding over borders, a ritual slight taken too seriously. But the pattern doesn't stop. It repeats, spreads, and hardens until everyone quietly accepts that conflict is no longer an exception. This is the world sliding into what later historians will call the Spring and Autumn period, a time named gently but lived tensely. One mainstream historical fact anchors this phase clearly. During the Spring and Autumn period, the Zhou king retained ritual authority, but real power shifted decisively to regional states that increasingly fought one another. The king still presided over ceremonies. He still embodied heaven's order, but armies no longer waited for his permission. War at first follows rules. States announce campaigns. Envoys travel between courts. There are expectations about timing. Harvest seasons are avoided. Messengers are respected. Noble captives are treated according to rank. These customs aren't kindness, they're structure. Everyone involved still believes order can be preserved if violence is properly contained. You feel the strain anyway. Taxes rise to support armies that now exist year-round. Young men leave more often and return less reliably. Fields go unattended longer. Grain stores are watched more carefully. Border villages fortify themselves quietly, not because war has reached them yet, but because it probably will. Here's a detail that captures the strange tone of this era. Some battles pause so both sides can eat, reorganize, or wait for commanders to arrive. Combat is still ritualized enough that stopping feels acceptable, until it suddenly doesn't. Historians still argue whether these early wars were restrained out of genuine moral belief, or because states lacked the logistical capacity for total warfare. Living through it, the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is that restraint is eroding. Each exception weakens the rule. Each successful violation encourages the next. Ideas start circulating more openly now. If the Zhou king can't enforce peace, what gives him authority? If heaven allows constant conflict, what does the mandate mean? These questions aren't shouted, they're murmured in courts, taught cautiously to students, tested in conversation before being trusted. Everyday life grows tense rather than chaotic. You learn the rhythms of danger. Certain routes are avoided, certain markets feel unsafe. Travel requires permission. Weapons become more visible, not because people want to fight, but because not being armed starts to feel irresponsible. Ritual continues, but it struggles to keep pace with reality. Victories are explained as heaven's favor. Defeats are framed as moral warnings. But when both sides claim heaven's support, the language thins. Moral certainty becomes strategic rhetoric. One subtle but important change. Records begin to multiply. States keep track of treaties, battles, alliances, betrayals. Writing expands because memory alone can't manage this level of complexity. History starts to look less like lineage and more like chronology. You sense that the old Zhou unity has passed the point of recovery. Too many states have learned to act independently. Too many rulers have tasted autonomy. The rituals still bind them loosely, but fear and ambition bind them more tightly. The spring and autumn world feels like a society arguing with itself in public. Everyone agrees order is necessary. No one agrees on how to restore it. Violence hasn't become absolute yet, but it's no longer embarrassing, as fighting becomes familiar. The moral language that once stabilized the Suo order begins to splinter. Different states interpret virtue differently. Heaven's silence grows louder, and in that silence, something new is preparing to take shape. Ideas sharper than ritual, systems stricter than tradition, and wars far less polite than anything you've seen so far. The age of managed conflict is ending. What comes next will not pause for meals. The talking doesn't stop when the fighting becomes familiar, it accelerates. War creates space for voices that would have sounded unnecessary before, and you begin to notice men traveling without land, without armies, carrying only ideas and a confidence that feels almost reckless. They move between courts, offering explanations for why the world is breaking, and promises about how it might be fixed. This is not an age of peace producing philosophy, it's disorder demanding answers. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment clearly. The spring and autumn period gives rise to what later generations call the 100 schools of thought, an era when competing ideas about ethics, governance, and human nature flourish. You don't experience this as a golden age of learning. You experience it as noise, conflicting advice, rival prescriptions, and rulers listening because nothing else has worked. These thinkers are not professors. They are advisors, tutors, critics, sometimes irritants. They survive by persuading rulers that their way of thinking can stabilize a state faster than swords alone. Some emphasize ritual and tradition, arguing that the old Joe moral order failed only because it wasn't followed properly. Others argue something more radical, that tradition itself is the problem. Here's a detail that often surprises people. Many of these thinkers travel with small groups of students who function as both followers and proof. A man with disciples looks credible. Ideas gain weight when others repeat them. You hear one voice more often than others, a man who speaks about relationships rather than laws, about behavior rather than punishment. His name will later be remembered as Confucius, though here he is simply another advisor struggling to be heard. He argues that chaos comes from broken relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, elder and youth. Restore those roles, he says, and order will follow. It sounds gentle, almost nostalgic. Historians still argue whether Confucius was politically influential during his lifetime or only became powerful through later interpretation. Living here, you notice that rulers listen politely but rarely commit fully. Moral persuasion takes time. Time is something states feel they no longer have. Other voices are sharper. Some argue that people are not naturally inclined toward good behavior, and expecting them to be virtuous is unrealistic. Systems, they say, should assume selfishness and control it. These ideas feel uncomfortable, but they resonate in a world where betrayal is common and trust is expensive. Daily life absorbs these debates indirectly. You don't hear philosophy lectures in the fields, but you feel their consequences when laws change tone, when punishments are reframed, when education for elite children expands beyond ritual memorization into argument and strategy. Words start to matter more because they justify action. One subtle shift reshapes authority. Persuasion becomes a skill equal to force. Rulers value advisors who can explain policies convincingly, not just enforce them. Language sharpens. Decrees grow longer. Moral reasoning is embedded into commands, not because everyone believes it, but because belief still smooths compliance. Ritual authority weakens further. Divination still exists, but it competes with argument. When a policy fails, rulers don't always blame heaven. Sometimes they blame bad advice. This alone marks a profound change. Responsibility begins to slide from the unseen world back onto human decisions. Historians still argue whether this intellectual flowering reflects genuine openness or desperation. From where you stand, it feels like triage. States are bleeding stability and trying anything that promises relief. Education becomes strategic. Sons of nobles are trained in rhetoric, history, and debate. Knowing how past states fell becomes a weapon. History is no longer just memory, it's ammunition. Different thinkers interpret the same past differently, offering rival lessons. The Shako fell because they grew complacent, the Shang fell because they grew cruel. The Zhou are failing because they grew weak. Choose the lesson you prefer. For ordinary people, the impact is indirect but real. Laws grow more formal. Expectations are clarified. The space for ambiguity shrinks. You're told not just what to do, but why doing otherwise threatens order itself. Explanation becomes a form of pressure. What unites all these thinkers, despite their differences, is a shared assumption. The old Jew model will not fix itself. Something fundamental must change. How rulers think, how people behave, how authority is enforced. As these ideas circulate, rulers begin selecting what suits them rather than committing to any single vision. Philosophy becomes modular. Moral language here, strict enforcement there. Whatever works stays. You live in the moment before theory hardens into policy. The arguments are still fluid, the future's still multiple, but the direction is clear. Ritual alone will not restore order. Tradition alone will not stop war. Whatever comes next will be sharper, stricter, and far less patient. The age of debate is not an ending, it's a narrowing. And as choices collapse toward effectiveness over elegance, the world prepares for a kind of order that does not care whether you agree, only whether you comply. When the wars stop pretending to be contained, everything accelerates. Armies grow larger not through prestige, but through arithmetic. States count people, count grain, count weapons, and discover that victory no longer depends on noble lineage or ritual timing, but on how many bodies can be moved, fed, and replaced. This is the beginning of the warring states world in full motion, and it feels colder than anything before it. One mainstream historical fact anchors this transformation. During the warring states period, military organization shifts toward mass infantry forces supported by centralized logistics, replacing the earlier dominance of aristocratic chariot warfare. You see this change in who fights. Noble warriors still exist, but they no longer decide outcomes alone. Farmers, laborers, and conscripts now form the bulk of armies. War becomes something the entire society participates in, whether it wants to or not. Training becomes systematic. Units drill repeatedly, learning formations rather than individual heroics. Commands are standardized. Mistakes are punished quickly because confusion costs lives. Weapons change to suit this scale. Crossbows spread rapidly, mechanical, powerful, and terrifying because they erase the skill gap between veteran and novice. A peasant with a crossbow can kill a noble from a distance. That single fact dissolves centuries of inherited military privilege. Here's a detail that reveals how war is becoming industrial. Some states issue written instructions for crossbow use and battlefield conduct, ensuring that training can be replicated exactly across thousands of soldiers. Warfare becomes teachable rather than hereditary. The impact on daily life is immediate. Conscription expands. Families plan around absence as a normal condition. Fields are worked by the young, the old, and whoever remains. Harvest schedules adjust to campaign calendars. Grain is stored not just for winter, but for armies on the move. The state's appetite grows, and it feeds constantly. Historians still argue whether this escalation was driven more by technological change or political competition. Living inside it, the forces feel inseparable. Better weapons demand better organization. Better organization rewards stricter control. Control enables larger wars. Each improvement locks the next into place. Diplomacy grows sharper as well. Alliances are temporary, transactional, and carefully documented. Betrayal is no longer shocking. It's expected. States measure each other not by ritual reputation, but by population size, arable land, and logistical reach. Maps matter now, so do numbers. Violence spreads beyond battlefields. Villages near borders are relocated or fortified. Civilians are moved strategically to deny resources to enemies. Scorched earth tactics appear, not as cruelty but as calculation. The aim is no longer to defeat an army, it's to cripple a state's ability to recover. You feel fear change character. Earlier fear was episodic, a raid, a flood, a bad omen. Now it's continuous. The future feels permanently uncertain, shaped by decisions made far away. You learn to read rumors carefully. A defeated army means new taxes. A victory means more conscription. Ideas harden alongside warfare. Soft moral appeals lose credibility. Rulers increasingly favor systems that produce reliable results regardless of individual virtue. Discipline becomes more valued than loyalty. Predictability becomes more valuable than tradition. One subtle but crucial change. Success begins to justify method. If a reform produces stronger armies and fuller granaries, its moral cost is ignored. Failure is the only sin that matters. This logic will define everything that follows. As campaigns stretch on, the number of independent states shrinks. Weaker ones disappear quietly, absorbed or dismantled. Their histories don't end in grand defeats. They end in administrative notices, new laws and new rulers issuing familiar demands. You are living inside a narrowing world. Each year, fewer options remain. Neutrality becomes impossible. To survive, a state must either expand or be consumed. Compromise loses value. Efficiency becomes morality. The warring states period doesn't feel like chaos from within. It feels like optimization. Ruthless, systematic, and relentless. Everything that doesn't contribute to survival is trimmed away. Ritual, lineage, and even older philosophies are kept only if they serve strength. By now, the question has changed. It is no longer how should we live, it is how do we win. And once a society accepts that framing, every other concern becomes secondary. The wars will not slow down, they will refine themselves. And the states that master this refinement will shape what the world looks like when the fighting finally stops. As the wars grind on, something quieter, but just as decisive begins to happen. Names start to vanish. Not people's names. You still know your neighbors, your elders, the officials who collect grain, but the names of entire states begin slipping out of daily speech. Where there were once many banners, many courts, many ways of doing things, there are now fewer, larger powers pressing outward. This is how rival kingdoms disappear, not in flames but in administration. One mainstream historical fact frames this erasure clearly. During the Warring States period, dozens of smaller and mid-sized states were conquered, absorbed or dismantled, leaving only a handful of major powers by the end. States like Jin, Wei, Song, Zheng, and Zhongshan don't fall because they lack culture or intelligence. They fall because they are outmatched in scale, organization, or timing. You experience this disappearance indirectly at first. Borders shift, tax collectors arrive with different seals, legal codes are replaced, ritual calendars are adjusted. The land doesn't look different, but the language of authority does. You're told to swear loyalty again, not because you resisted, but because the name above you has changed. Here's a detail that makes conquest feel unsettlingly mundane. In many cases, local elites are left in place, so long as they submit quickly. The same men oversee the same villages. Now speaking in the name of a new ruler, continuity softens shock, memory dulls. Some states are broken deliberately. Their populations are relocated, scattered across different regions so they can't rebel as a unit. This isn't random cruelty, it's policy. People who once shared stories, dialects, and ancestors are separated, folded into new administrative units. Identity dissolves through movement. Historians still argue whether these population transfers were widespread or limited to strategic areas. Living through it, you feel the logic more than the scale. Familiar faces vanish. New neighbors arrive with different customs. Everyone learns to adapt quietly. What's lost isn't just sovereignty, it's experimentation. Some of these erased states tried different reforms. Some balanced noble families carefully. Others invested in defensive engineering rather than expansion. Their failures are remembered only as cautionary tales told by the victors, stripped of nuance. Success writes history, failure becomes silence. Daily life under absorption is disorienting. You're told the mandate of heaven has clearly shifted. Resistance is framed not as loyalty, but as stubbornness. The explanation is always moral, never material. Heaven chose strength. Heaven favored efficiency. The story is repeated until it feels impolite to question it. You notice that maps, real or imagined, grow simpler. Fewer borders, fewer names to remember. This simplification feels comforting to rulers and unsettling to everyone else. Complexity once offered refuge. Now clarity means exposure. One quiet but important change. Law becomes more uniform. Earlier, each state had its own interpretations, its own loopholes. Under larger powers, rules are standardized. That consistency reduces confusion but increases control. There's less room to hide inside ambiguity. Language shifts too. Old state names survive briefly in poetry and private speech, then fade. Children grow up learning only the new order. Their histories begin later than yours. What you remember, they never learn. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of these states represented progress toward unity or catastrophic loss of cultural diversity. Standing here, the question feels abstract. What you feel is compression. The world is getting smaller, tighter, more legible to those at the top. As the major states absorb territory, their confidence grows. They test reforms more aggressively. They demand more from subjects because they can. The pace of change quickens. Survival now depends on being useful to a system that doesn't remember where you came from, only whether you comply. You sit with people who still remember old rulers, old laws, old songs. They speak of them quietly, without expectation that those memories matter anymore. The new order doesn't punish remembering, it simply doesn't reward it. This is how dynasties are forgotten long before historians argue over them. Not through dramatic destruction, but through relevance draining away. A state stops issuing commands, then it stops being named, then it stops being imagined as something that could ever return. The wars continue, but their outcome is already narrowing. Fewer states mean fewer futures. Each absorption removes an alternative way of organizing life, and with each erasure, the path toward a single dominating system becomes clearer. Not because it is chosen, but because everything else has been removed. You are living in the space where history becomes selective. What survives will be what wins. Everything else will exist only as fragments, buried foundations, altered laws, and people who remember names no one else recognizes anymore. By the time most people realize how much has changed, their lives have already adjusted around it. Endurance is no longer something you admire in others. It's a skill you practice daily, quietly, without expecting praise. The great wars redraw borders above your head, but your survival still depends on smaller calculations: how much grain to hide, when to plant despite uncertainty, which officials' attention to avoid. This is what life looks like in the middle of the warring states world. Not heroic collapse, but prolonged strain. One mainstream historical fact grounds this reality. During the warring states period, states increasingly relied on mass conscription and systematic taxation, placing unprecedented pressure on common households. You feel this immediately. Lists appear more often. Names are counted. Able-bodied men are expected to serve, sometimes repeatedly. Absence stretches from weeks into seasons, and return is never guaranteed. Farming becomes an exercise in anticipation. You plant, knowing you might not harvest. You harvest, knowing much of it won't be yours. Grain is measured carefully, parceled out to feed armies and officials before families. Hunger doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps. Meals shrink. Diets simplify. People grow thinner, quieter, more focused. Here's a detail that rarely appears in grand histories. Households learn to underreport. A teenage son is suddenly too young. An uncle is ill. These are not acts of rebellion. They're acts of arithmetic. Losing one worker can tip a family from survival into collapse. Everyone knows this. Officials know it too. The system tolerates some deception because it cannot function without the people it strains. Community changes shape. Trust becomes selective. Neighbors still help one another, but generosity is measured. Lending grain becomes risky. Theft increases, not violently but subtly. Tools disappear. Boundaries are tested. Disputes escalate faster because patience is a luxury. Historians still argue whether the suffering of common people during this period was worse than in earlier eras, or simply better documented. Living through it, comparison feels pointless. What matters is permanence. Crisis is no longer an interruption, it's the baseline. Family becomes the primary refuge. Marriages are arranged strategically, not romantically. Alliances between households matter more than affection. Children take on responsibility early. Elders shift from ritual authorities to practical advisors, valued for knowing which paths are safer, which officials are corrupt, which states are rising. The state intrudes constantly, but unevenly. Some regions are drained dry, others are favored as strategic centers. Migration increases as families relocate toward areas with lighter burdens or better protection. This movement reshapes populations quietly, accelerating the disappearance of local customs and dialects. One thing changes the emotional tone of life profoundly. Explanation stops comforting. Earlier, disaster could be blamed on ancestors or heaven's displeasure. Now, failure feels mechanical. You didn't meet quotas. You were in the wrong place. You were unlucky when a census came through. Meaning gives way to management. Education for elites expands rapidly. But for ordinary people, knowledge becomes narrower. You learn what helps you survive: crop timing, hiding places, negotiation. Philosophy debates exist elsewhere, shaping laws that reach you indirectly. You experience them as new regulations, not ideas. Violence remains present, but impersonal. Punishments are standardized. Mercy depends less on personal judgment and more on compliance. This consistency is terrifying in a different way. You know exactly what will happen if you cross a line, and that knowledge changes behavior more effectively than fear ever did. As years pass, endurance becomes generational. Children grow up assuming war is normal, absence is normal, authority is something distant and procedural. Loyalty shifts from abstract rulers to immediate networks. Family, village, whoever helps you last. You don't dream of peace anymore. You dream of stability, of predictability, even if it's harsh. The endless competition between states makes that stability feel impossible, but the desire for it sharpens. People begin to value any system that promises an end to constant uncertainty. This is how societies prepare themselves for radical order without realizing it. When chaos lasts long enough, control stops looking cruel and starts looking merciful. When choice brings danger, obedience begins to feel safe. As you lie down at night, exhaustion replaces anxiety. Tomorrow will bring the same demands. You will meet them because there is no alternative. Above you, states calculate. Below them, people endure. And between those two forces, a new kind of world is forming. One that will promise unity, not through tradition or persuasion, but through the elimination of alternatives. The warring states era does not break people all at once. It reshapes them slowly, until surviving inside systems of pressure feels normal. And once normalized, those systems can tighten further, because resistance has already been worn thin. The wars will not stop soon. But the conditions they create are already pointing towards something final. A power willing to impose order absolutely, because everyone beneath it is too tired to imagine anything else. Out of the exhaustion, quieter voices continue to circulate. Ones that never quite take control of a state but refuse to disappear. You don't encounter them in grand courts anymore. You hear them at the edges, in workshops in fortified towns that expect siege rather than ceremony, in conversations that begin with what if everyone mattered the same. These are the thinkers history almost leaves behind, not because they lacked ideas but because their ideas were inconvenient. One mainstream historical fact frames this moment clearly. Alongside Confucianism and legalist thought, the Warring States period produced rival schools such as Mohism, which directly challenged aristocratic privilege, ritual excess, and aggressive warfare. The most prominent name here is Mozi, though like many thinkers of the time, what survives is less a single voice and more a tradition carried by followers. Mohist ideas feel startlingly blunt in a world accustomed to hierarchy. They argue that people suffer because rulers favor their own families, clans, and states over everyone else. The solution, they claim, is impartial care, treating all people as equally worthy of concern. Not symbolically, practically. If rulers valued strangers the same way they valued kin, wars of expansion would make no sense. You can see why this doesn't go down well in elite courts. Here's a detail that often surprises people. Mohists organize themselves almost like a disciplined network. They train in defensive engineering, travel in groups, and offer their services to states under siege, not to help them conquer, but to help them resist attack. Walls reinforced, gates redesigned, defensive machines constructed. Their philosophy is backed by practical skill. Historians still argue whether Mohism was primarily a moral philosophy or a proto-technical movement focused on cost-benefit analysis and survival. Living alongside it, the distinction collapses. Their morality is grounded in results. If a practice causes suffering, it's wrong. If it prevents suffering, it's right. Ceremony doesn't excuse waste. Tradition doesn't excuse cruelty. This puts Mohists at odds with nearly everyone. Confucians see them as dismissive of ritual and social bonds. Legalists see them as naive about power. Aristocrats see them as dangerous. They argue against lavish funerals, expensive music, and ritual displays that drain labor and resources. To people barely surviving, these arguments make uncomfortable sense. Daily life absorbs fragments of these ideas even when states reject them officially. Siege warfare becomes more defensive. Fortifications improve. Some rulers quietly adopt Mohist techniques while ignoring their ethics. Practical knowledge survives where ideology does not. Other overlooked voices circulate too. Some thinkers argue that nature should be followed rather than controlled, that forcing order creates suffering. Others experiment with strategy, persuasion, and psychological warfare. Many names don't survive. Their ideas do. Scattered, absorbed, unattributed. One subtle shift matters here. Debate becomes comparative. Rulers no longer ask, "Is this right?" They ask, "Which method works better?" Schools of thought compete not on truth, but on outcomes. This turns philosophy into a toolkit. Pick what produces stability. Discard the rest. For ordinary people, these debates are felt through policy changes rather than speeches. Funeral expenses are restricted. Public works are prioritized differently. Some states reduce ritual spending during wartime. Others ignore such advice completely and collapse faster. You don't hear the arguments, but you live their consequences. Historians still argue whether Moahism failed because it was impractical or because it threatened elite interests too directly. From where you stand, it feels like both. Universal care sounds admirable, but it demands sacrifices from those who benefit most from inequality. Those people control armies. As warfare intensifies, Mohist resistance efforts slow expansion in some regions, buying time but not changing outcomes. Their defensive expertise is respected. Their moral claims are tolerated. Their vision of a less violent world remains largely unrealized. What survives of these schools isn't dominance, but residue. Ideas about efficiency, utility, and equal consideration seep into other systems, stripped of their original intent. Legalist thinkers borrow the emphasis on results, administrators adopt cost calculations, ethics dissolve into metrics. You sense that something important is being lost. Not because these thinkers were right about everything, but because they represented alternative futures, ways the world might have organized itself differently if survival hadn't narrowed every decision into a competition. As states continue to consolidate, space for dissent shrinks. Traveling scholars find fewer courts willing to listen. The market of ideas contracts. Only philosophies that promise strength, predictability, and obedience remain attractive. The others don't vanish completely. They linger in fragments, techniques, half-remembered sayings, but their moment passes quietly. The world no longer asks how to reduce suffering. It asks how to endure war. And in a world that has learned to value endurance above all else, the ideas that survive will be the ones that make endurance enforceable. By now, war is no longer something that interrupts life. It is the framework life is organized around. You don't measure years by harvests or festivals anymore, but by campaigns, reforms, and border changes. The warring states world has finished transforming violence into a system, and once that happens, everything else reorganizes itself to serve it. What separates this phase from earlier fighting is scale and predictability. One mainstream historical fact defines it clearly. Warring states' governments develop centralized bureaucracies capable of registering populations, taxing production, and supplying armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. War is no longer improvised, it is planned years in advance. You feel this in paperwork before you feel it in battle. Households are registered, land is surveyed, grain yields are estimated. The state begins to know you not as a person, but as a unit of output. How much you can produce, how many men you can supply, how quickly you can be replaced. This knowledge is power. Logistics become decisive. Armies no longer live off whatever they can seize locally. Supply trains move behind them. Granaries are built specifically for military use. Roads are widened, straightened, maintained. These aren't civic improvements in the modern sense. They exist to move soldiers and food efficiently. Civilian benefit is incidental. Here's a detail that shows how deep this transformation goes. Some states introduce standardized weights and measures, so supplies can be calculated precisely across regions. Efficiency becomes a moral good. Waste becomes a crime. Training hardens. Soldiers are drilled until movement becomes reflex. Formations matter more than bravery. Commanders are judged on outcomes, not honor. A general who retreats to preserve forces may be praised, while one who fights bravely and loses is punished. The values of earlier aristocratic warfare collapse completely. Historians still argue whether this industrialization of war was an inevitable outcome of competition or a conscious choice by reforming states. Living inside it, inevitability feels like an excuse. Decisions are made deliberately, systems are built, people are reorganized to fit them. The crossbow dominates battlefields now. Its range, power, and ease of training make individual skill less important than coordination. Armor improves slowly, but casualties rise anyway. Death becomes statistical. A loss of 10,000 men is recorded as a number, not a tragedy. Civilian life is reshaped accordingly. Border regions are cleared to deny enemies resources. Villages are relocated inland. Some areas are turned into buffer zones, land where no one lives permanently because survival there invites invasion. These decisions are framed as necessary. They rarely include consultation. Fear changes texture again. Earlier, fear came from sudden raids or unpredictable disasters. Now it comes from certainty. You know another campaign is coming. You know taxes will rise. You know conscription will follow. The only unknown is timing. Ideas that cannot serve this machine fade rapidly. Ritual persists, but stripped of influence. Moral debate continues, but only insofar as it supports discipline. Confucian language survives in education. Mohist techniques survive in defense. Legalist structures dominate everything else. One subtle shift matters enormously. Loyalty is redirected from lineage to state. You are expected to serve not because of who your ancestors were, but because the system demands it. Identity becomes administrative. You belong where your registration says you belong. As states absorb territory, their systems expand rather than adapt. Conquered populations are slotted into existing frameworks. New laws are imposed quickly. Resistance is discouraged not through terror alone, but through inevitability. The system presents itself as permanent. Historians still argue whether this era represented progress toward unity, or an unprecedented collapse of human cost. Standing here, the question feels detached. What you experience is compression. Fewer choices, fewer safe places, fewer futures that don't involve obedience. The warring states world is no longer experimenting. It is selecting. Methods that produce strength survive. Those that don't are discarded, regardless of moral weight. War has become a filter through which every idea must pass, and the filter is narrowing fast. Only a few states remain large enough to compete at this level. They copy each other's reforms, refine each other's methods, and push their populations harder each year. Neutrality is impossible. Hesitation is fatal. You live inside a system that no longer asks what kind of world it wants to build. It asks only how to eliminate rivals before they do the same. And when a society commits fully to that logic, it doesn't stop until someone wins absolutely. The wars are no longer about balance. They are about ending the game. And somewhere among the remaining states, one is learning how to do exactly that. By now, war is no longer something that interrupts life. It is the framework life is organized around. You don't measure years by harvests or festivals anymore, but by campaigns, reforms, and border changes. The warring states world has finished transforming violence into a system, and once that happens, everything else reorganizes itself to serve it. What separates this phase from earlier fighting is scale and predictability. One mainstream historical fact defines it clearly. Warring states' governments develop centralized bureaucracies capable of registering populations, taxing production, and supplying armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. War is no longer improvised. It is planned years in advance. You feel this in paperwork before you feel it in battle. Households are registered. Land is surveyed. Grain yields are estimated. The state begins to know you not as a person, but as a unit of output. How much you can produce, how many men you can supply, how quickly you can be replaced. This knowledge is power. Logistics become decisive. Armies no longer live off whatever they can seize locally. Supply trains move behind them. Granaries are built specifically for military use. Roads are widened, straightened, maintained. These aren't civic improvements in the modern sense. They exist to move soldiers and food efficiently. Civilian benefit is incidental. Here's a detail that shows how deep this transformation goes. Some states introduce standardized weights and measures, so supplies can be calculated precisely across regions. Efficiency becomes a moral good. Waste becomes a crime. Training hardens. Soldiers are drilled until movement becomes reflex. Formations matter more than bravery. Commanders are judged on outcomes, not honor. A general who retreats to preserve forces may be praised, while one who fights bravely and loses is punished. The values of earlier aristocratic warfare collapse completely. Historians still argue whether this industrialization of war was an inevitable outcome of competition or a conscious choice by reforming states. Living inside it, inevitability feels like an excuse. Decisions are made deliberately, systems are built, people are reorganized to fit them. The crossbow dominates battlefields now. Its range, power, and ease of training make individual skill less important than coordination. Armor improves slowly, but casualties rise anyway. Death becomes statistical. A loss of 10,000 men is recorded as a number, not a tragedy. Civilian life is reshaped accordingly. Border regions are cleared to deny enemies resources. Villages are relocated inland. Some areas are turned into buffer zones, land where no one lives permanently because survival there invites invasion. These decisions are framed as necessary. They rarely include consultation. Fear changes texture again. Earlier, fear came from sudden raids or unpredictable disasters. Now it comes from certainty. You know another campaign is coming. You know taxes will rise. You know conscription will follow. The only unknown is timing. Ideas that cannot serve this machine fade rapidly. Ritual persists, but stripped of influence. Moral debate continues, but only insofar as it supports discipline. Confucian language survives in education. Mohist techniques survive in defense. Legalist structures dominate everything else. One subtle shift matters enormously. Loyalty is redirected from lineage to state. You are expected to serve not because of who your ancestors were, but because the system demands it. Identity becomes administrative. You belong where your registration says you belong. As states absorb territory, their systems expand rather than adapt. Conquered populations are slotted into existing frameworks. New laws are imposed quickly. Resistance is discouraged, not through terror alone, but through inevitability. The system presents itself as permanent. Historians still argue whether this era represented progress toward unity or an unprecedented collapse of human cost. Standing here, the question feels detached. What you experience is compression. Fewer choices, fewer safe places, fewer futures that don't involve obedience. The warring states world is no longer experimenting, it is selecting. Methods that produce strength survive. Those that don't are discarded, regardless of moral weight. War has become a filter through which every idea must pass, and the filter is narrowing fast. Only a few states remain large enough to compete at this level. They copy each other's reforms, refine each other's methods, and push their populations harder each year. Neutrality is impossible. Hesitation is fatal. You live inside a system that no longer asks what kind of world it wants to build. It asks only how to eliminate rivals before they do the same. And when a society commits fully to that logic, it doesn't stop until someone wins absolutely. The wars are no longer about balance. They are about ending the game. And somewhere among the remaining states, one is learning how to do exactly that. Next time, you begin hearing one name more often than the others. Spoken not with admiration but with unease. It comes up in reports, in rumors carried by merchants, in the careful tone officials use when they think no one important is listening. Qin. At first it sounds like just another state on the western edge, far from the old Zhou heartlands, but distance you're learning can be an advantage. One mainstream historical fact frames Qin's rise clearly. Through a series of sweeping reforms in the 4th century BCE, Qin transformed itself into the most centralized and disciplined state of the Warring States period. While other states argued over tradition and balance, Qin simplified. That simplicity would prove lethal. Qin's land is harsher than most. Rocky soil, colder winters, fewer natural advantages. This shapes mentality. Waste is not tolerated because it cannot be afforded. Qin rulers adopt reforms that strip away old aristocratic privilege and replace it with measurable service to the state. Rank is no longer inherited. It is earned through military success. Heads taken in battle become units of promotion. Brutal, efficient, unmistakable. Here's a detail that reveals how deeply this system cuts. Qin soldiers are rewarded individually for kills, breaking collective noble honor and replacing it with personal incentive. War becomes transactional. Courage is calculated. Legalist ideas take root fully here. Laws are written clearly. Punishments are severe but predictable. Rewards are public. Everyone knows the cost of failure and the benefit of success. Historians still argue whether Qin's population obeyed out of belief or fear, but from inside the system the distinction blurs. Predictability itself becomes comforting in a chaotic world. Administration penetrates daily life. Households are organized into mutual responsibility groups. If one person breaks the law, everyone answers for it. This destroys the safety of anonymity. It also destroys rebellion before it begins. Silence becomes complicity, and complicity becomes survival. Agriculture is reorganized aggressively. Land is redistributed to maximize output. Idle land is punished. Farmers are rewarded directly for surplus. Irrigation projects expand relentlessly. Iron tools are pushed hard. Grain becomes weaponry. Qin feeds its armies better, longer, and more reliably than its rivals. Other states notice too late. Qin doesn't flaunt culture. It doesn't host famous scholars. It doesn't compete in ritual elegance. It competes in logistics. While courts elsewhere debate morality, Qin counts wagons, men, and days of supply. Here's the unsettling part. Conquered territories aren't negotiated with. They are dismantled. Old elites are removed or relocated. Laws are imposed immediately. There is no pretense of continuity. Qin doesn't want loyalty. It wants compliance. Historians still argue whether Qin's rise was inevitable once these reforms took hold, or whether rival states could have stopped it by adopting similar systems earlier. Living in the moment, inevitability feels like hindsight. What's clear is momentum. Each victory feeds the next. Each reform makes reversal harder. Fear spreads ahead of Tren armies, not because they are more brutal in battle. Others are just as violent, but because they do not stop. They don't pause to consolidate culturally. They don't compromise. Once Qin decides on a target, the machinery moves until the target is removed. For ordinary people, stories from the West are chilling. Whole regions reorganized overnight. Registers rewritten. Families relocated. Local customs ignored. The old moral language, heaven's favor, ancestral displeasure, sounds thin when faced with an army that moves regardless of omen. Qin doesn't reject heaven. It simply refuses to wait for it. Ritual exists, but it does not delay policy. This is a profound shift. Earlier states acted after justification. Qin justifies after success. As Kim grows stronger, rival states scramble. Some attempt reforms of their own, but without the same consistency. Others cling to old elites and fracture internally. Alliances form and dissolve rapidly. Nothing slows Qin's advance. You sense that something final is approaching, not because war is new, but because the style of war has changed. Qin is not trying to dominate a balance. It is trying to erase competition entirely. The world you've lived in for generations, a world of many states, many ideas, many futures, is thinning fast. Qin's methods are not elegant, they are not gentle, but they work, and in a world exhausted by constant war, effectiveness becomes irresistible. The last phase has begun. Once Qin's momentum becomes obvious, everything else starts moving faster, not forward, but inward, collapsing toward a conclusion no one quite wants to say out loud. The remaining great states know what Qin represents. They don't misunderstand it. They just hope desperately that it will slow down long enough for something, an alliance, a reform, a mistake to stop it. One mainstream historical fact defines this phase with uncomfortable clarity. In the final decades of the Warring States period, Qin systematically defeated the last major rival states through a combination of military innovation, administrative discipline, and relentless campaigning. This is not a war of one dramatic showdown, it is a sequence of removals. You feel this as a tightening. Diplomatic envoys travel constantly. Alliances are proposed, accepted, betrayed, and reproposed. Everyone knows cooperation is necessary. No one trusts it to last. States that once saw each other as existential enemies now share information, exchange hostages, and coordinate movements, not out of friendship but fear. Qin exploits this perfectly. It avoids fighting multiple enemies at once whenever possible. It isolates targets, pressures borders, offers temporary truces, then strikes when coordination falters. Its armies move with confidence that comes from planning years ahead rather than reacting month by month. Here's a detail that shows how calculated this phase becomes. Qin generals prioritize cutting supply lines and capturing administrative centers rather than chasing battlefield glory. A city falls not because its walls are breached heroically, but because its granaries are seized and its registers captured. Control follows paper as much as force. Other states attempt reforms too late. They adopt legalist policies unevenly. They try to strip aristocratic privilege, but elites resist. They attempt population registers, but enforcement is inconsistent. Half reforms anger everyone without delivering results. Qin's system works because it is applied without hesitation. Historians still argue whether Qin's rivals failed because they lacked imagination, or because their social structures were too entrenched to change quickly. Living inside the moment, failure feels less philosophical. It feels logistical. Qin shows up with more food, more soldiers, and clearer command. Battles themselves are brutal but efficient. Crossbows dominate. Infantry formations absorb losses without collapsing. Retreats are calculated rather than shameful. Commanders are promoted or punished based solely on outcomes. There is no room for noble excuses. Victory is the only acceptable explanation. Civilian life in the remaining states grows desperate. Taxes spike as rulers attempt to match Qin's capacity. Conscription deepens. People are moved, counted, and reassigned constantly. Migration increases as families flee frontiers that no longer feel defensible. Rumors outrun armies, carrying fear into regions not yet touched. One unsettling change becomes noticeable. Hope shifts away from survival of one's own state and toward survival under conquest. People begin asking not can we win, but what will Qin do when they arrive? That psychological shift matters. Resistance weakens long before defeat. Qin's reputation amplifies its power. Stories circulate of swift reorganization, harsh punishments, and immediate control. These stories aren't exaggerated, they're accurate. Qin does not negotiate tradition, it replaces it. That certainty terrifies elites who depend on ambiguity to survive. States fall one by one. Each collapse feels shocking and inevitable at the same time. A court evacuates, a king is captured, and administration dissolves. Within weeks, Qin officials arrive, registers are rewritten, and the old order becomes illegal. Memory is dismantled with administrative speed. Historians still argue whether the final conquests were experienced as catastrophic or merely exhausting by ordinary people. Living through it, catastrophe feels too dramatic a word. Exhaustion fits better. People are tired of uncertainty. They are tired of multiple rulers, multiple laws, multiple demands. Qin offers one system, Harsh, yes, but singular. You notice that heaven is rarely mentioned now, not because belief has vanished, but because it no longer explains anything useful. Concrete victories are not framed as moral triumphs. They are framed as outcomes. This is new. Power no longer needs cosmic language. It stands on organization alone. As the final rival states prepare their defenses, you sense the end of an era approaching, not with ceremony, but with paperwork. Armies still march, cities still burn. But what truly ends worlds now is registration, relocation, and replacement. The warring states period is not ending because peace has been achieved. It is ending because competition is being eliminated. The system that survives will not tolerate rivals. It will not allow alternatives to linger. It will not explain itself beyond success. You live in the narrowing moment before multiplicity disappears. The future is no longer branching, it is funneling. And kin stands at the narrowest point, waiting for everything else to arrive. The wars have taught people how to endure almost anything. Now that endurance is about to be claimed by a single power that knows exactly how to use it. When kin's armies move on from conquest to consolidation, the change is immediate and disorienting. The fighting may pause, but the pressure does not lift. In some ways it intensifies. War destroys bodies, administration rearranges lives. You feel the second more persistently. The victors do not linger to celebrate. They arrive to count. One mainstream historical fact defines this phase sharply. After each conquest, Qin dismantles existing state structures and replaces them with centrally appointed officials answerable only to the Qin ruler. Old courts are dissolved. Titles tied to lineage are abolished. Authority is no longer inherited locally. It is assigned, monitored, and revoked from the center. This is not occupation, it is absorption. Registers are the first sign. Households are counted again, even if they were counted last year by a different state. Names are written down. Ages, relationships, land holdings, tools, livestock, everything is recorded. What cannot be accounted for is treated as a problem. The system prefers visibility over trust. Here's a detail that captures the shock of this transition. People who once defined themselves by clan or former state are now identified primarily by administrative units. You belong to a district, a group of households, a register entry. Identity becomes legible. Old elites face a choice that isn't really a choice. Submit and be relocated. Stripped of local influence but allowed to live. Resist and be removed entirely. Many choose survival. Their former authority dissolves quietly as Qin officials assume control of courts, granaries, and military stores. The past is not debated. It is replaced. Historians still argue whether Qin deliberately sought to erase regional identities, or whether uniformity was simply a byproduct of efficient governance. Living through it, the effect feels intentional. Local customs are tolerated only if they do not interfere with regulation. Ritual calendars are standardized. Laws apply everywhere, the same way, without exception. Punishment is swift and predictable. This is crucial. Fear comes not from randomness but from certainty. Everyone knows the penalty for failure. Everyone knows enforcement is consistent. In a world exhausted by uneven rule, this consistency has a strange calming effect. You may not like the rules, but you can plan around them. Daily life becomes narrower but more stable. Taxes are heavy but clear. Labor demands are intense but scheduled. Arbitrary cruelty decreases even as overall pressure increases. The system is not kind, but it is reliable. For people worn down by generations of chaos, reliability feels almost merciful. Here's the uncomfortable truth many don't admit. Some people prefer this, not because it's gentle, but because it ends uncertainty. No more guessing which lord is rising. No more shifting borders. One authority, one law, one set of expectations. And Qin does not rewrite history immediately. It doesn't need to. Instead, it renders the past irrelevant. Former state names disappear from official use. Old laws are void. Previous titles are meaningless. Children grow up learning only the current system. What isn't taught stops shaping behavior. Historians still argue whether this rapid consolidation planted the seeds of Qin's own collapse. Living here, collapse feels abstract. What you experience is compression. Fewer choices, fewer paths, less room to adapt creatively, but also fewer surprises. Infrastructure expands rapidly. Roads are extended. Standardized measurements are enforced. These changes are not symbolic, they are functional. Movement, supply, and communication improve dramatically. The state sees farther, faster, and with more clarity than any before it. One thing is unmistakable. Heaven is no longer invoked as justification. Qin doesn't claim moral superiority, it claims effectiveness. Success validates policy. Failure invites correction. This is power stripped of ornament. As weeks pass, the silence after war fills with instruction rather than relief. Notices replace rumors. Officials replace soldiers. The world feels smaller, flatter, more tightly controlled. The variety that once defined life, different laws, customs, rulers, fades. You realize something profound has ended. Not just the wars, but the possibility of choosing between systems. The Qin order does not argue its right to rule. It enforces it. And enforcement, once accepted, reshapes expectation. This is how unification actually begins. Not with ceremony, but with compliance. Not with celebration, but with adjustment. The old dynasties are not denounced. They are simply rendered unusable. History, from this point forward, will be written from a single center, and everything that came before will be filtered through that lens, summarized, moralized, simplified. You live in the moment when the past stops being a source of authority and becomes a subject of control. And once control reaches memory itself, power no longer needs to fear rebellion. It only needs to manage what people remember. The Qin world does not ask whether it should exist. It proceeds as if the question no longer matters. Once consolidation settles in, the most unsettling change is how quickly people adapt. What felt unbearable at first becomes routine within a generation. Children born under Qin rule don't experience conquest as trauma. They experience it as normal. This is how systems endure, not through force alone, but through habit. One mainstream historical fact anchors this phase firmly. Qin standardized writing, measurements, currency, and law across its territories, creating the first truly unified administrative system in Chinese history. You feel this in small, constant ways. Weights in the market match those in distant towns. Official notices use the same characters everywhere. Orders no longer need translation or interpretation. Uniformity reduces friction and resistance. The old scripts are discouraged, sometimes banned. Not because they are wrong, but because difference complicates control. Standard characters make officials interchangeable. A clerk trained in one region can be sent anywhere. Writing stops being cultural expression and becomes infrastructure. Here's a detail that reveals how deliberate this is. Standardization is enforced through punishment. Using non-approved measures or scripts isn't treated as tradition, it's treated as defiance. Consistency becomes law. Roads expand outward from the center, straight and wide, built to move troops and grain efficiently. Villages are connected whether they want to be or not. Travel becomes faster, but more visible. Movement is tracked. Registers follow you. The state sees farther than ever before. Historians still argue whether Qin's obsession with uniformity was visionary or paranoid. Living inside it, it feels efficient but suffocating. The system leaves little room for local adaptation. What worked in one valley is imposed on another without adjustment. Errors scale quickly, daily life stabilizes, but creativity shrinks. Laws are clear, punishments are known, innovation happens only when ordered. Spontaneous solutions, once essential for survival, are now suspicious. Order demands predictability, not ingenuity. Families reorganize further. Mutual responsibility groups tighten. If one person fails, others pay. Silence becomes a civic duty. Loyalty is no longer emotional, it's procedural. You don't need to believe in the system, you need to follow it. One uncomfortable realization spreads quietly. Rebellion no longer feels imaginable, not because people are content, but because organization has removed the gaps rebellion once relied on. There is nowhere to gather unseen, no authority to appeal to, no alternative structure waiting to replace the current one. Historians still argue whether Qin's rule collapsed because it was too harsh, or because it left no room for flexibility under stress. Standing here, stress hasn't arrived yet. What you feel is tightness, a system pulled taut, efficient, and brittle. The past continues to recede. Old stories survive only in private speech. Public memory becomes shallow, focused on present obligation rather than lineage. The idea of ancient history shortens dramatically. What came before Qin feels distant even though it happened only generations ago. This is how dynasties are truly forgotten. Not when they fall, but when their memory no longer informs behavior. The Xia, Shang, Zhao, and rival states fade into moral examples rather than lived realities. They become tools, not ancestors. You sense that unity has been achieved, but at a cost that no one has fully counted yet. Order has replaced uncertainty. Consistency has replaced diversity. For a society exhausted by war, this feels like relief. But relief built on rigidity carries its own danger. Systems that cannot bend do not absorb shock well. And although Qin appears invincible now, history has not finished testing it. Still, from where you stand, the noise has finally stopped. There are no rival courts issuing competing commands, no banners clashing at borders, just one authority, one set of rules, one version of order. And for the first time in generations, the future feels singular, even if no one is quite sure whether that singular future is meant to last. Once there is only one authority left, something subtler begins to matter more than armies or laws. Memory. Not personal memory. You still remember who you are, but shared memory. The kind that tells people where they came from and what alternatives once existed. Qin rule doesn't begin by attacking memory directly, it simply deprioritizes it. And neglect over time can erase as effectively as destruction. One mainstream historical fact shapes this phase decisively. The Qin state controlled historical records and official learning, favoring practical administration over preservation of earlier traditions. The goal was not nostalgia. It was efficiency. History that did not serve governance was treated as irrelevant. And irrelevance is the first step toward disappearance. You notice this in education. Instruction focuses on law, calculation, and obedience. Moral lessons are permitted only insofar as they reinforce compliance. Old histories are summarized, moralized, stripped of detail. The Shai, Shang, Zhou once-living frameworks are reduced to cautionary tales about failure. Complexity vanishes. Nuance is inconvenient. Here's a detail that reveals how erasure works quietly. Official scribes are trained in standardized scripts that exclude regional variations. When a way of writing disappears, the stories tied to it become harder to access. Language itself becomes a filter. People still tell old stories at home. Of course they do. Memory doesn't vanish overnight. But these stories lose public relevance. They are no longer useful for explaining law, justifying action, or teaching children how the world works now. Children listen politely. Then they grow up inside a system that never asks them to remember. Historians still argue whether Qin actively destroyed older texts, or whether later dynasties exaggerated this to distance themselves from Qin harshness. Living inside the moment, what you experience is narrower than legend but broader than accident. Certain texts become dangerous not because they oppose the state, but because they remind people that things were once organized differently. Administration rewards forgetfulness. Advancement depends on mastery of current law, not knowledge of past systems. Remembering too much becomes impractical. Survival favors focus. People adapt accordingly. This is how dynasties truly disappear. Not when their palaces fall, but when their logic stops shaping decisions. The Zhou collapse mattered less than the moment when people stopped expecting ritual authority to protect them. The Shang vanished when ancestors stopped being consulted for governance. The Shah faded when flood control stopped defining legitimacy. You feel this loss most acutely in conversation. Names that once carried weight now require explanation. References fall flat. Shared understanding shrinks. The past becomes abstract. Ironically, archaeology will later recover what memory loses: foundations, bones, vessels, but without context. These objects will need interpretation. Historians will argue over labels, over continuity, over whether dynasties were as unified as texts claim. You live at the moment where that ambiguity is created. One unsettling realization settles in. The past has been simplified so thoroughly that resistance loses its reference points. It's hard to imagine alternatives when you cannot name them. Control over memory does not need constant enforcement. It sustains itself. As daily life continues under Qin order, the old dynasties don't feel violently erased. They feel irrelevant. And irrelevance is more final than destruction. You are living through the quietest kind of ending. The moment when history stops being something people live inside and becomes something they are told about. And once history is told rather than remembered, whoever controls the telling controls what survives. The forgotten dynasties are not forgotten because they lacked achievement. They are forgotten because their worlds no longer fit inside the system that replaced them. Even as Qin's order settles into place, unease lingers beneath the surface. Not as open resistance, but as a quiet awareness that something essential has been compressed too tightly. The system works, that's the problem. It leaves no space for failure, and no space for recovery when failure inevitably arrives. One mainstream historical fact frames this tension clearly. The Qin state, despite achieving unification, relied on extreme centralization and legal severity that left it vulnerable to sudden collapse once pressure exceeded tolerance. You don't feel collapse yet, you feel rigidity. Every law is fixed, every punishment is mandatory, every response is prescribed. The system has no memory of flexibility because flexibility was purged as weakness. Daily life continues under predictable strain. Labor projects expand, roads, walls, canals, executed with speed and discipline, unmatched by any previous dynasty. These works impress later generations, but living inside them feels relentless. Time is measured in quotas rather than seasons. Rest is allowed, but only when scheduled. Here's a detail that reveals the danger of this efficiency. Officials are punished for leniency, as harshly as for corruption. Mercy becomes a risk. Enforcement becomes a risk. Enforcement becomes mechanical. People stop negotiating with authority and start enduring it. Historians still argue whether Qin's collapse was caused more by harsh laws or by the rapid succession of rulers after unification. Living here, the seeds are already visible. Fear enforces obedience, but it also silences feedback. Problems go unreported. Mistakes compound quietly. The population adapts by withdrawing emotionally. Compliance replaces engagement. People do what is required, and nothing more. Initiative declines. Creativity dries up. The system remains strong but brittle, like metal worked too hard without rest. Memory continues to narrow. The past is taught as a straight line leading inevitably to the present order. Alternative paths vanish from imagination. This makes the present feel permanent, but permanence is dangerous when circumstances change. You notice that heaven, once central to political legitimacy, has all but disappeared from public explanation. This is intentional. Heaven introduces uncertainty. Law does not. But without heaven, there is no language for moral failure at the top, only procedural error. And procedural error is punished, not corrected. As murmurs of discontent surface, they lack coordination. People don't rebel yet. They wait. Waiting becomes the dominant strategy in a world where action is punished swiftly. The silence feels heavy. Archaeology will later show signs of strain, unfinished projects, hurried construction, abandoned works, but you live inside the pause before rupture. Everything looks functional, nothing feels sustainable. The forgotten dynasties you've passed through offer different ways of absorbing stress. Ritual flexibility, local autonomy, moral persuasion. Qin discarded all of them. What remains is powerful but alone. History has narrowed to a single experiment. Can absolute order replace adaptation? The answer is coming, but not yet. For now, the system holds, and because it holds, it teaches later rulers something crucial. Not that Qin failed, but that Qin showed what unity requires. Future dynasties will soften the edges, reintroduce ritual, reframe heaven, but they will not abandon centralization. You are standing at the hinge of memory. Behind you lie worlds defined by plurality. Ahead lies an empire that will claim to be eternal, even as it learns quietly from Qin's limits. The forgotten dynasties are no longer competing for survival. They are being reinterpreted, flattened into lessons that serve whatever comes next. And as the pressure builds, the final transformation begins. Not in battle, but in the rewriting of what stability is supposed to look like. What survives Qin is not its cruelty, but its shape. When the pressure finally breaks, and it will, sooner than anyone expects, the world does not return to what came before. The old dynasties do not re-emerge. The river does not restore local kings. The past does not come back to rescue anyone. Instead, what follows inherits Qin's skeleton and dresses it in softer language. One mainstream historical fact frames this moment with clarity that later generations will try to blur. Although the Qin dynasty collapses quickly after unification, every major dynasty that follows keeps Qin's centralized administrative framework. Counties remain, registers remain, standardization remains. What changes is how power explains itself, not how it functions. You feel this transition in tone rather than structure. New rulers speak of moderation. They restore ritual language. Heaven returns to political speech. Moral explanation comes back, not to dismantle Qin's system, but to make it livable. The harshest edges are filed down, punishments are adjusted, officials are encouraged to temper law with judgment, but the core remains untouched. Here's the uncomfortable detail history often hides. The Qin experiment does not fail in the way people imagine. It succeeds too well. It proves that unity through force and administration is possible. What collapses is not the system, but the tolerance for its intensity. Later dynasties learn the lesson quickly. Keep the machine, soften the grip. Historians still argue whether Qin's legacy should be judged as tyrannical overreach or revolutionary foundation. Living in the aftermath, the argument feels academic. What matters is continuity. People are not given back their former autonomy. They are given a version of control that feels familiar enough to endure. This is where the forgotten dynasties truly vanish. The Shai, Shang, Zhou, and countless rival states are no longer remembered as viable alternatives. They are reframed as stepping stones. Their complexity is compressed into morality tales, too weak, too cruel, too fragmented, too indulgent. Their successes are absorbed, their failures are exaggerated. Education formalizes this memory. Official histories are written from the perspective of unity. The past is organized to point toward the present. Dynasties that did not unify are portrayed as incomplete. States that valued balance over dominance are described as naive. Multiplicity becomes synonymous with chaos. You notice how language shifts. Words like order, under heaven, and the realm take on singular meaning. The idea that multiple systems could coexist stops being thinkable, not illegal, unthinkable. This is the deepest form of erasure. One subtle consequence matters deeply. Resistance loses historical legitimacy. When rebellion occurs, it must frame itself not as an alternative system, but as a correction within the existing one. Even dissent borrows the language of unity. No one argues for a return to many states. That idea is gone. Archaeology will one day uncover remnants of forgotten capitals, ritual centers, and border states. Scholars will debate labels, chronologies, and influence, but without living memory, these discoveries required interpretation. The story no longer belongs to those who lived it. It belongs to those who organize it. You live in the moment when the past becomes raw material. Dynasties are no longer ancestors. They are data points, lessons, justifications. Their lived worlds, the fear, the adaptation, the local logic are flattened into summaries that support the present order. The Qin collapse teaches rulers how far they can push. The Zhou collapse taught them why explanation matters. The Shang collapse taught them how ritual binds. The Shah collapse taught them that control of labor creates power. Each lesson is extracted, purified, and redeployed. This is how history actually progresses, not by replacing systems entirely, but by refining control and memory together. What came before is not destroyed, it is repurposed. As time moves forward, the idea of China as a single civilization solidifies, not because it always existed, but because alternatives have been erased from practice and memory alike. Unity becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. The forgotten dynasties are not forgotten because they lacked influence. They are forgotten because their influence was absorbed so completely that it no longer needed to remember them by name. You stand at the edge of that absorption, watching the past dissolve into narrative. The world ahead will call itself continuous, ancient, unbroken. You know better. You lived the fractures, but knowing does not restore what is gone. It only sharpens the understanding that history belongs to those who survive long enough to explain it. And explanation, once standardized, becomes another form of rule. By the time the dust finally settles, it doesn't feel like an ending. There is no single moment where someone declares that the old worlds are gone for good. Instead, you notice it in what no longer needs explaining. People stop asking how things used to be organized. They stop comparing rulers. They stop imagining other arrangements. The question of alternatives fades, not because it was answered, but because it stopped feeling relevant. You live now in a world that calls itself unified, ordered, and inevitable. Roads run straight, laws apply evenly, commands arrive from one direction and are not contradicted by another voice claiming equal authority. For a generation raised inside war, this feels like relief, not happiness, relief. The absence of constant uncertainty is itself a kind of quiet reward. One mainstream historical fact closes the long arc you've traveled. After centuries of fragmentation, the political model of a single centralized empire becomes the dominant framework in East Asia, shaping governance for millennia. What began as experiments in flood control, ritual authority, moral legitimacy, and legal enforcement has narrowed into a single structure capable of surviving time. But survival comes with cost. The forgotten dynasties you pass through, the Shah remembered through legend, the Shang through bones and bronze, the Zhou through moral language and fractured rule, do not vanish because they were weak or foolish. They vanish because their solutions were partial. Each answered one problem well and failed at another. None solved the problem of scale without losing flexibility. History will later compress them into steps on a ladder. as if the present was always waiting at the top. That is not how it felt living through them. Each system felt complete while it lasted. Each made sense on its own terms. Each collapsed not through stupidity, but through limits exposed by changing conditions. You realize now that what truly survives is not virtue, ritual or law alone, but the ability to coordinate people faster than resistance can form. Qin demonstrated that brutally. Later dynasties learned to soften the method without abandoning the core. Heaven returned to speeches, ritual returned to court, moral language returned to education, but the administrative spine remained. This is why the earlier worlds feel so distant, even though they are the foundation of everything that followed. They were absorbed, simplified, and taught as lessons rather than lived realities. Their diversity became inconvenient. Their ambiguity became dangerous. Their memory became optional, and yet traces remain. They remain in the idea that rulers must justify themselves, even if justification is selective. They remain in the suspicion of excess, the fear of fragmentation, the emphasis on order over spontaneity. They remain in the deep cultural memory that chaos is not abstract, it is lived, exhausting and costly. You are left with a quiet understanding that history is not a smooth river flowing forward, but a series of narrowed channels carved by pressure, loss and choice. What survives is not what was best, but what endured long enough to explain itself as necessary. The forgotten dynasties are not gone. They are underneath everything, buried, compressed and silent, shaping the ground on which later worlds stand. And as the noise of conquest, reform and collapse finally fades, what remains is not triumph but stillness. Now the pace slows, the roads stretch out into the distance without urgency, the fields rest between seasons. The voices that once argued, commanded and demanded begin to soften, as if the land itself is exhaling after centuries of tension. You don't need to hold every name, every date, every detail. Let them drift. What matters has already settled. The feeling of long endurance, of people adapting again and again to forces larger than themselves. Dynasties rose not because they were destined, but because someone solved a problem at the right moment. They fell not because they were evil, but because the world changed faster than they could bend. As you lie here listening, imagine the quiet after the river recedes, leaving silt behind. That silt becomes the ground for something new. Not perfect, not permanent, just stable enough to rest on for a while. The Xia fade into legend. The Shang linger in bronze and bone. The Zhou echo in ideas of order and morality. The Qin harden the shape of power. None of them disappear completely. They dissolve into one another, like layers of earth pressed together by time. Your breathing slows. The arguments of historians no longer matter. The debates about inevitability can wait. For now there is only the long continuity of people living, adjusting and sleeping under the same sky that watched all of it unfold. Let the old dynasties stay where they belong, deep in the background, steady and quiet. There is nothing you need to solve tonight, nothing you need to remember precisely, just the sense of a vast past settling into rest.